My name is Mark Polliger, and I'm glad to be hosting Professor Robert Mnookin today. Professor Mnookin is the current Williston Professor of Law at Harvard. I think I got that right. As well as the chair of the program on negotiation there, which is dedicated to the study of the theory of and advancement of the practice of negotiation. Professor Mnookin's latest studies and book focus on negotiating under the challenging condition when you see who you're negotiating with as an adversary or even as evil. To do so requires specific techniques to arrive at the best outcome while avoiding common pitfalls that can sabotage you and the eventual results. The book is so new, published 2 days ago, that we're among the first to hear about it right from the source. And after the talk, we will have some folks from Books Inc. if you want to order a copy of it with a Google subsidy, and then you'll be able to pick it up later. And to tell us more, please welcome Professor Robert Mnookin.
Thank you very much. It's exciting to return to Silicon Valley and be at Google. I had the good fortune of eating in your cafeteria. I did that once before, a couple years ago, with the general counsel of your company and some other Googlers, and it's quite an experience to look around for the checkout counter where you paid and find none. I'm here to talk about my new book. And the question I address in the book is, should I bargain with the devil? Now, by bargain, I mean try to resolve a conflict through negotiation rather than resisting or fighting. And by devil, I mean an adversary you don't trust. A person or organization who you think its interests are opposed to your own, who may be out to harm you. An adversary you may even think is evil. Now, you can read in the newspaper every day about how relevant this question is. For example, right now, our national leaders are really trying to figure out, should we negotiate with the Taliban or should we not? It turns out that in 2001, after 9/11, President Bush gave Mullah Omar an ultimatum: turn over bin Laden and his compatriots and shut down the training camps, or we're going to invade. In fact, although this isn't very well known, Mullah Omar's response at the time was, let's negotiate. What's your evidence that bin Laden was responsible, et cetera? And President Bush said, I'm not inviting a negotiation. I mean, this is an ultimatum. And he went in. Today, there's a new question. Today, should we be negotiating with Mullah Omar, who's in Pakistan, or not? Similarly, with respect to Iran and North Korea, there's been lots of discussion. What should be the role of engagement or negotiation? Google itself, of course, with respect to the issues your company faces in China, which in some respects, in my view, in some respects is an evil regime, poses analogous questions. Now, apart from these issues of high politics, in business, there are analogous issues people often face. For example, I've mediated a number of failed joint ventures where there's been a terrible falling out between joint venture partners. The question is, should you negotiate with a joint venture partner who betrayed you? If a competitor you believe is stealing your intellectual property, should you fight or should you negotiate? Indeed, one reason I was interested in writing this book is I think there are analogous problems that arise in families. I've claimed that almost every family, at least if you're willing to go back a couple generations and perhaps out to cousins, every family has a story of a family fight over family property. Sometimes the property is grandma's engagement ring. Sometimes it's a photographic album. Sometimes it's a family business that has to be divided up. But there are any number of families, I'm curious, hands raised. How many of you know a family story where family members aren't speaking to each other anymore because of a fight over family property? Well, it looks like at least 30%. It's very common. Well, you have probably heard two arguments, or two extreme or categorical answers to the question, should you bargain with the devil? Now, in my field, I chair the program on negotiation at Harvard, and I'm the head of what's called the Harvard Negotiation Research Project. In my field, you've heard the categorical answer, and that is you should always negotiate. You should always be prepared to sit down in a problem-solving way, see if you can work out some arrangement that's better for you and for the other side than litigation, much less war. It's an appealing argument, and you hear it all the time. You also hear the opposite kind of argument, less commonly in my zip code 02138 in Cambridge. But that argument is really based on the Faustian legend. And that is, you should never negotiate with the devil. The devil's not to be trusted. He may be smarter than you. He's going to certainly try to trick you. And to negotiate risks soiling your soul and selling out principles that you should hold dear. It was not so long ago when, after 9/11, Vice President Dick Cheney declared, and I'm quoting, "I have been charged by the President with making sure that none of the tyrannies of the world are negotiated with. We don't negotiate with evil, we defeat it." Well, there's the two categorical answers. Now, I have to confess, I'm allergic to categorical answers because usually you can find a counterexample to embarrass a categorical claim. And what I want you to think about for a moment, who are your two greatest political heroes of the 20th century? Think about it to yourself. 20th century. I'm an old guy. This is a new century. Here are my two greatest heroes. All right? Winston Churchill is my hero because in May of 1940, in Britain's darkest hour, when France was on the verge of collapse, when the United States was uninvolved in the war and had not even begun Lend-Lease, when the Soviets had signed a pact with Germany, and were not in the war, Churchill and his war cabinet faced the question of whether they should accept an invitation to have Mussolini mediate a negotiated resolution of the war between Germany and Great Britain. There were 5 days of secret discussions in the War Cabinet. The minutes of those meetings are now available. In his monumental post-war, after the war history, Churchill wrote a multi-volume history of the World War II. He doesn't mention this fact. But in fact, they struggled with the question of whether to negotiate or not, and Churchill, in my view, appropriately decided not to negotiate. Although it turns out it's a very hard question, and I have a chapter of the book about that. My other hero, perhaps my greatest negotiation hero, is Nelson Mandela. Mandela, after being convicted and given a life sentence for treason in 1985, having been jailed already for more than 20 years, secretly initiated negotiations with the National Party, the Afrikaner party that had imposed the evil apartheid regime. I have a chapter about this episode too. Mandela, although the most famous member of the ANC, was not, in fact, the head of the ANC. That was Oliver Tambo, who was in exile. Moreover, the ANC, in many ways, ran on quite collaborative principles. And Mandela had a number of longtime compatriots jailed with him in the same prison. In his memoir, Mandela struggled with the question, should I initiate negotiations, given that the ANC's policy was against any form of negotiation with the hated enemy, and should I do so without consulting first the ANC leadership, or at least my compatriots here? He was able to smuggle information, things in and out to Tambo, but it sometimes took weeks. And he candidly writes, I decided it was time to initiate negotiations, and I did so without asking anyone. Why didn't I ask? Because I knew what their answer would be. That is, I shouldn't negotiate. So here you have my two great heroes. One a hero because he refused to negotiate, another a hero because he secretly initiated negotiations. And I ended up, having thought about it, deciding that the challenge, of course, is how do you make wise decisions about whether to negotiate or not if there aren't categorical answers one way or the other. And the challenge, I think, is to make wise decisions. And what my book tries to do is offer a framework for how to think through contextually in a particular set of circumstances what a wise decision would be. And I do this through stories, 8 real-life stories. 2 of them I've already mentioned. I'll briefly mention some of the others a tad later in my talk, because I think there's much to be learned by assessing what others have done and trying to, I ask myself, if I applied my framework, would I agree or disagree with a particular decision? Let me describe briefly one case that is similar to a case I discuss in the book. And that is, assume you are the CEO and founder of a high-tech startup that's been venture financed. You're a research and development firm. You don't manufacture devices yourself. You, in fact, license it out. Assume that you have a partner, which is that I've changed the names, needless to say, the giant Baikuda Corporation, a very large Japanese company that has licensed your technology and know-how and has the right to manufacture and distribute your medical device, but it promises that it won't distribute any competing devices, and you've given them a license for major segments of the world, but not China. You excluded China specifically. You just discovered, 3 years into a 5-year joint venture agreement, that secretly the Baikuda Corporation has manufactured a knockoff, slightly different, but not significantly in your eyes at all, a knockoff of your product, which it's selling in China. You confronted the head of the Baikuda Corporation with your discovery, and He says he denies that the product is violating any of your rights. And he says, besides, you don't really understand the Chinese market. And by the way, your 15% royalty rate for the rest of the world is too high. Let's negotiate. Maybe we'll negotiate a new agreement. Maybe we'll include China, but it's got to be everything at a much lower royalty rate. What do you do? Now, in the kinds of conflicts I'm describing, whether international or family or business, emotions run high. You are furious. You feel cheated, you feel betrayed. You're probably a little angry for yourself for being so trusting. The notion of negotiating turns your stomach. You want to fight. How do you decide? How do you make a wise decision? Well, luckily, there's someone who can help you. He's a Vulcan. His name is Mr. Spock. Mr. Spock is logical, he's very analytical, and he has complete emotional detachment. Indeed, your spouse says he's a cold fish. But he's prepared to advise you. And in fact, in my book, Mr. Spock suggests some questions that you should ask yourself. First, he says, you've got to think hard about what your underlying interests are and what the other side's interests are. Second, very importantly, if you don't negotiate, what are your alternatives away from the table? Here, perhaps you could sue. Where are you going to sue? What is the probability of success? Third, are there potential negotiated outcomes that can better serve your interest than your best alternative away from the table, and also better serve the interest of your adversary? Because if you can't imagine any negotiated outcomes that would better serve the interests of both sides, there's no reason to expect there's a very high probability you're going to be able to achieve a negotiated agreement. Next, if you reach an agreement, assuming you can imagine such an agreement, can it be implemented? Will it be enforceable? Obviously, the devil is someone you don't particularly trust. And finally, what are the costs of negotiation? Negotiation itself isn't costless. It may set a precedent. It may have reputational consequences. You've got to think about all these things. Now, in this particular case, it turns out your legal alternative is not very good. Suing in China would be impossible. Suing in Japan, which is a possibility, is very time-consuming and slow, and it's almost inconceivable that a Japanese court would enjoin a Japanese company from doing business in China. The problem, Spock points out, and your lawyer has told you as much, is it's not clear you can get jurisdiction over the Baikuta Corporation in California because they've never really operated here very well. You might, but you might not. Spock thinks there's a 20% chance. So what does Spock advise? Spock advises you should contact your adversary, you should indicate a willingness to negotiate, but you should also indicate that if negotiations don't work, or if you are going to sue in California, and you should indicate to Baikuta Corporation that its reputation in Silicon Valley, because you've heard via the grapevine that they are interested in other joint ventures in the United States, their reputation would plainly be damaged by the mere fact of the lawsuit, and that's something they'd want to take into account. Now, what I talk about in the book are a series of psychological traps that make it difficult to think rationally about whether to negotiate or to fight. And let me just very briefly list some of them and say a word about each. One is demonization. These traps are often present when people are in intense conflict. Demonization really is the notion the other side's evil. They're a bad person. You're making judgments about their overall character. A second trap is tribalism. It's our team against their team. We're the insiders, they're the outsiders. You don't usually trust the other side very much. Dehumanization, in the worst kinds of conflicts, people don't even see their adversary as human. Moralism, goodness and right is entirely on my side. I'm right, they're wrong. No gray. The zero-sum fallacy is something that I talk about all the time in negotiation. Zero-sum fallacy is when I'm in conflict with you, what I think is anything you win, I lose. Anything I win, you lose. You talk about zero-sum mentality, the zero-sum gremlin shrieking in people's ears. Look at what's going on in the United States Congress today between the Democrats and the Republicans. It's as if anything that could possibly benefit one party has to be bad for the other party. It's zero-sum. The fight-flight fallacy, you know what that is. The call to battle is when the leader says, follow me. We're going to charge ahead. Now, all of these things, in my mind, can really get in the way of thinking clearly. Apart from these traps, though, I also want to acknowledge what makes these kinds of cases very difficult, and that is there are considerations of legitimacy, morality, identity, and self-respect. It's quite possible that the CEO, once he'd calmed down and really understood the opportunities and risks of refusing to negotiate rather than following Spock's strategy, it's possible that the CEO could say, Spock, I understand what you're saying, but to negotiate with this company after what they've done, I'm not worried about with my reputation with other people. It's my reputation with myself. It's inconsistent with the kind of person I want to be. And often in terms of these issues of bargaining with the devil, there is this problem. And that is, it really goes to a deep philosophical question. Are you prepared to be a utilitarian and a consequentialist that's going to decide what to do by comparing outcomes? Or are there some values that you feel are so important that you're willing to pay the cost and take the risks? Let me just say a word about some of the other chapters in the book, and then I'd like to take some questions. Rudolf Kastner was someone who decided to negotiate with Adolf Eichmann in 1944. Talk about bargaining with the devil. Kastner wanted to do so in order to try to save some Hungarian Jews. He, in fact, succeeded through bribery in saving 1,700 who were put on a train and ended up going to Switzerland. Tragically, after the war, he ended up going to Israel. He was accused of collaboration. There was a libel trial in which a trial court judge wrote an awful opinion condemning him for having sold his soul to the devil, for having negotiated with Eichmann, and having his own family members were among the 1,700 that made it on the train. That decision was ultimately reversed by the Israeli Supreme Court, but not before a right-wing Israeli extremist assassinated him. Very tragic story. Another chapter is about someone else who confronted an evil regime, Natan Sharansky. He was a refusenik in the Soviet Union. He refused to cooperate at all with the KGB. The KGB signaled to him while he was in prison, look, if you will denounce your cause, we'll let you go. We'll let you emigrate to Israel to join your wife. And we know very well, I mean, they were winking. We know that once you get there, you'll say that we coerced you. We understand that. But what we want you to do is just sign here renouncing your cause. He wouldn't do it. And indeed, when he was released, finally, the United States swapped a Soviet spy for Sharansky some years after he'd been in jail, about 12 years. The Soviet agent that took him to East Berlin where he was going to be freed, when they landed in Berlin, said to him, there's a car waiting for you over there. You must walk in a straight line between the plane and the car. And Sharansky said to this guy, for 12 years, I haven't done anything you've asked me to do. Why do you think I'll start now? And he walked in a crooked line and got in the car. I was the neutral in a huge dispute in the late 80s between IBM and Fujitsu. A chapter of the book is about that. IBM believed that Fujitsu had stolen its operating system. And at the time, with its operating system, Fujitsu had displaced within Japan IBM as the top mainframe computer manufacturer. This was in the age of the mainframe. I had an extraordinarily interesting experience. There was, I assure you, much demonization on both sides, and I tell the story of this case. I also did some work with the San Francisco Symphony about a decade ago. They had a catastrophic strike, and someone from the Hewlett Foundation called me when I was on vacation and said, Mnookin, you got to come out here and teach these people how to negotiate. And there's nothing like being interviewed for a job you don't think you want, but I ended up doing it. It was an extraordinarily interesting experience. In fact, I'm talking at the Commonwealth Club on Friday, and some musicians and the people I've worked with, some of them are going to be there. It's a story with a reasonably happy ending. I tell a story which doesn't have a very happy ending about a terrible divorce where there wasn't any negotiation and great damage to a child, to two children caught in the middle. And finally, I tell a story, another case I was actually involved in, involving a fight over a beautiful Cape Cod waterfront property that had been in a family for 50 or 60 years, that was inherited as tenants in common by three siblings, one of whom lived in the Bay Area and wasn't interested in, just wanted to sell. Another of the siblings thought this house was their family and was sort of profoundly offended that she might try to force a sale. Let me close by simply repeating my question. Should you bargain with the devil? My answer is not always, but more often than you feel like it. More often than you feel like it for two different sorts of reasons. First, because of these emotional and psychological traps that can make it very painful. And second, because in bargaining with the devil, you often need to reach an agreement that benefits the devil also, and which may involve, in your mind, the sacrifice of principle on the altar of pragmatism. That never feels too good. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to take some questions.
So thank you very much. Very, very good talk. There's a microphone over here if people do have questions. We are going to be putting this up on YouTube, so please use the mic if you have questions so we make sure we get it recorded.
Hi, thanks for the talk. You've got what seems to be a dichotomy between either negotiation versus fight, as you've framed it. Can you speak at all to tactics which are used to build political power first as preludes, potentially preludes lasting years to build up sufficient power to actually get to the negotiating table? I mean, many of the great stories of nonviolent resistance are about that, where you don't start with negotiation, you start with things that look like nonviolent fighting,
Right.
But then 10, 20 years later it becomes a negotiation where you get what you want.
I think that's a terrific point, and I agree with you entirely, although the subtitle of the book suggests a dichotomy. In fact, the most famous article I've ever written is called Bargaining in the Shadow of the Law. Most legal conflicts are resolved through negotiation, but it's in the shadow of what people think a court might do. And often what you want to do is persuade the person on the other side that you are prepared to pursue alternatives that may be coercive as part of a negotiation strategy. And so I entirely agree.
What do you think about the case for Libya? There was a period of time where there was no negotiation, and there was a period of time there was negotiation. Do you think that eventually negotiation was the right thing to do with Libya?
Absolutely. In fact, Libya is quite an extraordinary example of the use of coercive diplomacy in terms of trying to isolate Libya, in terms of putting economic pressure on Gaddafi, ultimately led to the opportunity to negotiate with Libya a deal where they gave up all their aspirations to having nuclear weapons. And I think it was a great triumph of diplomacy. And it illustrates the point that came up before. Often what you want to do is employ a strategy which is, by some measures, coercive, but also being willing to engage. I mean, that is, in fact, I think, what President Obama is trying to do with Iran now, in terms of having more onerous economic sanctions, if in fact they aren't prepared to negotiate. I must confess I'm not terribly optimistic, but it's certainly a mixed strategy that seems appropriate given the absence in that case of a very good military alternative.
Yeah, could you speak a little bit to the use of negotiation basically to achieve two ends? One is a delaying tactic in order to, wait for something else you were doing to sort of insulate you against, your opponent. And the other as a tactic to divide your opponent, if it's a group or a corporation where by simply offering the alternative to negotiate, you can split them into two camps and prevent them from being successful really at either one. It seems to me a lot of times negotiation in some of these very tense situations falls into that realm of strategy sometimes. And if you could just speak to that a little bit.
That's a great point, and I think often two things. First, parties sometimes use negotiation not with the purpose of trying to reach a deal at all, but as a way to play for time. I think when the history of our negotiations with Iran is written, they have brilliantly resisted negotiations, and then when things get a little tighter, offer a little something more, and the Europeans get very tempted and want to do it, in terms of trying to divide our coalition, right? And yet, nothing much comes of it. And meantime, if one's cynical, you could say they're playing for time. They're really not interested in negotiating an arrangement where they're going to give up the possibility of nuclear weapons. Your other point is a very important point, and it relates to a couple of the chapters in the book. And that is, some of the most intense conflicts are not across the table, but behind the table, within an organization, within a government. People who were involved in arms control negotiations during the Soviet era said negotiating with the Soviets was patty cake compared to the negotiations between the Defense Department, the State Department, the CIA, the National Defense Agency, the various government groups that were trying to establish what the American negotiation posture should be. And you're quite right that often a shrewd negotiator can try to make offers that will divide the adversary. Let me give an example. It's one that Richard Bernstein today in the International Herald Tribune, it's on the New York Times website, wrote an article that I was thrilled with about my book, where he talks about negotiating with the Taliban. And he interviewed me. And I differentiate between three different sorts of Taliban. the Taliban are not an undifferentiated mass where it's a tightly controlled group. They're no longer in control of the government. Some are what I call the $10 Taliban. The $10 Taliban are those that, if we were to offer them $12, might be prepared to switch sides and lay down their arm. By all means, we should try to do that if we can, in my view. Another group are regional leaders who may not be ideologically committed to a fundamentalist, the imposition of an extreme form of Islam, but who are very distressed by the corruption in the current national government and want various local reforms. By all means, I think we should negotiate with these sorts as well. But I don't think, for example, that it makes a lot of sense to attempt to negotiate with Mullah Omar and the top Taliban leadership, because I could imagine a deal, but I think that deal would involve a form of power sharing where they may well regain complete national control, and in all events, in certain regions, it is my belief they'd want to shut down schools for girls and make life, and I assure you, there wouldn't be many Google searches going on. I mean, the cosmopolitans in that segment of Afghanistan would have a very hard time. I don't think that's worthy of us to do, at least. It's one thing if ultimately the Afghan government wants to do it. So I offer that as, you know, I think that when you're looking at the other side, often there are divisions that you really want to take into account in terms of figuring out a reasonable strategy.
So one of the things that is frequently used rhetorically when discussing whether or not to negotiate is the phrase madman. Yes. And it comes up in personal negotiations as well, which is that at some point you have to make the call that the person who you're negotiating with or the group you're negotiating with is not even capable of acting in what you would consider to be their self-interest. Either they're, you know, some sort of religious extremist who's willing to blow themselves up, or they're, you know, committed to something that it makes it impossible to negotiate with them. How do you judge whether or not you should negotiate or not negotiate based on whether the person is crazy?
Two observations. First, in the book, I end up concluding that there should be a presumption in favor of negotiation. What negotiation involves is trying to persuade someone else to make a deal that serves your interests, you hope, very well, and will serve their interests better than their alternative. If you haven't tried to persuade, it's hard to know whether they are susceptible to persuasion. Okay? And so I don't want to claim that any of us all the time are Mr. Spock-like, and that intuition and emotion make no difference. They do. Indeed, there are all these traps. But on the other hand, I think people often can be persuaded and can be, through a process, think more deeply about what's in their own long-run interests. I think that opportunity you should often, as I say, should you bargain with the devil? Not always, but more often than you feel like it, because I think often, in fact, people can be persuaded, where you might just assume they're crazy, and they won't be. That's the first point. Second point, obviously there are some people who really are a little crazy. Whatever that might mean in different contexts. Third, and this is sort of a Thomas Schelling game theoretical point, as you know, in terms of bargaining, to appear to be crazy is often quite rational, because it may persuade you that they really will blow themselves up and everybody else up if I don't give them $6 more. That if this deal isn't 68-32 rather than 60-40, where you think somebody'd have to be crazy to blow the deal up over that difference. But in fact, if someone can persuade you that they're crazy enough to do that, and through some kind of commitment strategy, prepared to do it, that can in fact be rational. That's what makes negotiation very interesting, in a way, right? I mean, you never quite know. And in many negotiations with respect to distributive aspects of bargaining, you know, people end up playing some kind of game of chicken, which is a very dangerous game to play, because like the old movie Rebel Without a Cause, sometimes there's going to be a crack-up, you know, and somebody's going to die. Maybe both sides will. In teaching negotiation, I don't encourage people to play chicken.
What do you think of the Nixon-Kissinger strategy of negotiation?
You've got to be more concrete, because I think they...
Speaking of madmen, like, I'll press the button way of negotiation.
You may know something I don't know, but I'm not aware of when Kissinger threatened to...
For example, the Christmas bombing over North Vietnam, bombing of the harbor near
yes.
Near Hanoi, right as negotiations were taking place.
Right. No, look, tactically, I think there probably were lots of mistakes made, but often what parties are doing is taking coercive actions at the same time. What they want to encourage is some kind of negotiated agreement. I think that probably was an example. It often doesn't work. In fact, it sometimes just stiffens the resistance of the other side and makes them less willing to talk. But that's what's going on. And in fact, you see companies doing similar things where they take very aggressive legal action, but at the same time signal that they're willing to talk.
So you covered negotiations that span, you know, nearly a century today, specific cases. Human nature really hasn't changed that much, yet you're making your life a study of negotiation. Things have changed. Speed of information is much faster than it was, but I mean, what really is changing in sort of the field? I know it's a little bit more open question.
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, on the one hand, the flow of information, in part because of what all of you are doing, is fantastic. I mean, at dinner parties, I can ask Google what year Italy was unified when someone was claiming it was 1880 and I thought it was a little earlier, and get the answer, boom, right away. It's unbelievable. It's fantastic. And you would think that that ought to, I think it does, make the world better. On the other hand, I think human conflict is inevitable. And the challenge is not to eliminate conflict, because conflict can in fact be constructive. It's to eliminate the most destructive forms of conflict to the extent you can. And in that regard, what I love about this field is it's very interdisciplinary. And human beings are very complicated creatures. And we all have real capacity for being rational and analytic on the one hand. On the other hand, we all are also, in terms of decision making, often driven by emotions in ways that sometimes can lead us astray pretty badly. And I think in these most intense kinds of conflicts, that's the case. I don't think that's going to change. I think that we're, in fact, hardwired, I believe, to have one part of our brain that is very good at rational analysis, but is slow and ponderous. But we have another part of our brain that's very quick, very intuitive. It will invoke early experiences, stories we've been told, all kinds of stuff that we may not even be conscious of. And I think that too can affect behavior. So that's what makes this an interesting field.
Do you think by being willing to negotiate and openly saying that you're willing to negotiate, you lose your ability to actually negotiate? You think
You
that's
lose the ability to negotiate?
do you you become weaker in your position.
You know, I guess one message of the book is everything is contextual. And what you have to do is think through these series of questions and what their implications are in a particular context. For example, there are certainly situations where I think a company would be foolish to negotiate. I mean, I'll give you an example that comes up. Someone illegally takes your property. You know you can win the lawsuit. You sue them, but it's going to cost you $100,000 to pursue the litigation. And they say, let's negotiate. You know, the lawyer says, give me 10 grand and I'll resolve it. Now, in the short run, settling for 10,000 seems a lot better than spending 100,000 and winning the lawsuit. But on the other hand, if in fact your feeling is there are hundreds of other people that if they figure they can get a quick $10,000 by doing this, will do it. And the precedent may matter to you. And having a reputation that you won't tolerate it could make perfectly good sense. So that's an example where you might be a little tempted, but the problem is you may be setting a precedent that in fact in the long run isn't good for you. And in that instance, if I were asked to advise the company, I would say you shouldn't settle. You should fight. Well, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be here.